Buenos dias, everyone. I also apologize for not speaking in Spanish this morning. I was a comparative literature major in college, and I also read Don Quixote and Gabriel Garcia Marquez in Spanish, but I could only talk with you about narrative theory and not about peace building. So please interrupt me if I'm speaking too quickly or if you have questions. And again, I hope that the next time I'm here, I can speak in Spanish. But I'd like to thank the Fundación CeiBA and all of you for letting me present today. It is such an honor to be here. The world is full of pain and grievance right now. I spent my first night in Bogota watching the news unfold about the coup in Turkey, interspersed with updates about the attack in Nice. But being here with you brings me real hope and inspiration. You are the future of peace here in Colombia and around the world. You are what will make peace take hold. Because peace does not happen simply with the signature of a peace agreement, as magnificent an achievement as that is. Peace takes hold in the thousands of daily interactions that take place from citizen to citizen, on every level, from the home to the national stage, in every realm of human endeavor, from education, art, and community dialogue, to land use, public health, security sector reform, and foreign policy. You have the passion, and you are learning the skills to bring sustainable peace to Colombia, and to teach the world how a country can make such a profound transformation. In French, peace building is translated as consolidation de la paix, or consolidation of peace. And I never really truly appreciated that nuance until I came here to Colombia. And I realized the importance of the threshold that you are on in this stage of the peace process. You here today are the people who will truly consolidate peace in Colombia, a heroic task and a gift for the generations ahead who will live in peace in this beautiful country. You will come up with techniques that are new, that are relevant for your culture and for a new era of technology and connectedness that will resonate with the future that you will imagine. My talk today is entitled Peace Building from the Inside Out, Making the Leap from Neuroscience to Outer Space. And I want today to take you on a journey on some of the most innovative ideas and practices that I see from my position at the Alliance for Peace Building. And then I'd like to outline for you some of the skills that you as young peace builders will need to become innovators yourselves in the world of peace building. So as Juan Felipe mentioned, I'm the president of the Alliance for Peace Building, a network of 106 peace-building organizations working in 153 countries on everything from reconciliation and mediation to civilian protection and security sector reform, arts and peace building, transitional justice and demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. And what's really interesting about our alliance, but the peace building field as a whole right now, is that our members are increasingly coming from outside the peace building field, from major development organizations like Mercy Corps and Catholic Relief Services, from educational organizations like NAFSA and IREX, from groups focusing on religion, such as the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, and even conservation groups like Conservation International, with the idea that unless they work with the conflict issues, they will never be able to tackle their core missions. And just to make an important definitional issue clear at the beginning, there are two very different kinds of peace. There's negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is simply the absence of conflict. And you can imagine many situations where security is very tight, peace agreement has been signed, but there's still anger, hostility, and grievance boiling under the surface. It's important to have an absence of conflict, I'm not against that, but what we work on at the Alliance for Peace Building is positive peace. And those are all the factors that go into helping societies resolve difference and resolve conflict. There will always be conflict. But how a society uses dialogue and politics rather than deadly violence to resolve that conflict is what positive peace is about. So our work at the Alliance focuses on 3 major areas. We work on innovation and the newest ideas in peace building with affinity groups, so collections of experts who work on issues like social enterprise, conflict and fragility, women in peace building, neuroscience, and electoral violence. So little laboratories in these very new areas of peace building. We measure the impact of peace building. It's one of the things that makes us weak as a field as compared to education or public health. It's a lack of good metrics for measuring peace. How do you know when your program has actually had an impact on peace in a country when peace often happens over a generation? So we have a consortium that's working to develop methodological rigor and to change the culture of how we monitor and how we evaluate the impact of our work. We also work with Hollywood and with major advertisers to change the narrative of peace. And there's a little bit of a feel that peace is somehow tied up with Birkenstocks in the 1960s, and there's a whiff of something soft about it. And we actually send messages that peace building is hard-edged, concrete, scientific, and something that everyone can do. It's not only for experts. We work closely with government, both in the US and other policy centers of the world, to advocate for peace-building approaches to security. And I'll talk more about those efforts a bit later. But what is the context in which we're operating? 21st century conflict looks very different from the conflict that I studied in the mid-'80s with Samuel Huntington and other realists at Harvard. Now we see a blurring of the boundaries between internal conflict and civil war and external cross-border issues. We see cross-border violence, where if you're looking at the drivers of conflict, you can't look at any one country. You'll have to look at much larger forces. We're seeing a toxic mix of crime and violence in countries like Libya and Honduras, where our old ways of dealing strictly with the political issues doesn't work because we have to look at a whole range of rule of law issues to get at those criminal dynamics. When we look at the crises of Ebola or Zika, we see crises both of health but also trust in governments to be able to handle those epidemics. And finally, on violent extremism, we're seeing a challenging paradigm of violence intermixed with media, religion in the case of ISIS, gang tactics, and a very new form of violence that we as a peace-building community need to struggle very hard to resolve. But the very nature of power itself is changing. Moises Naim, in his book, The End of Power, talked about how even powerful entities, heads of government, heads of business, feel that power isn't what it used to be. There are many more spoilers who can take away your power. But put more positively, power has devolved to a civil society level in a way that would have been unheard of when I entered the peace-building field. So much of what I'll talk about today looks at the power of civil society in a networked world and how to understand these new forms of power, some of which are very positive, some of which, like ISIS, are very negative, a non-state actor. But peace building has changed in response to these new forms of power and new forms of conflict. That 20 years ago, when I entered the field, it was very new. It wasn't even called peace building. It would be called conflict resolution or perhaps peacemaking, peacekeeping, but not peace building. There are a very small number of organizations, such as Search for Common Ground, Partners for Democratic Change, working very specifically on negotiation, mediation, and facilitation, very much process-oriented kinds of issues. I'll call that Peace Building 1.0. Over 20 years, there's a greater understanding that peace building is not just about process, but about structure. And for those of you who read the 2011 World Development Report by the World Bank, that talked about the focus on institutions as being the key around which peace has to happen, can see that shift from a process to more of a structural response. What also happened in Peace Building 2.0 was this expansion into other organizations that I mentioned earlier. We did a study, which is on our website, that looked at 400 organizations in the general area of peace and conflict, human rights, education, women, health, and we asked them, do you do peace building? And a huge number of them said yes, because they said as a development organization, we can't do our job unless we understand peace. Well, if that's Peace Building 2.0, what is Peace Building 3.0? And this is really what our organization works on. Peace Building 3.0 is the understanding of the complex system in which conflict and peace are working. And that there really is no such thing in a complex system, as all of you know who are studying this. You can't have linear change. You really have to work on the system itself, reading the system, responding to the system, and understanding that what gives you leverage in a conflict system might look very different from what you might predict looking at a linear, more complicated fashion. So perhaps a rule of law program or an education program will have more impact than a peace-building program per se. But how we work across disciplines, how we work with people whose languages and terminologies are very different from our own, and understand that system together is really at the heart of Peace Building 3.0 and what I'll be talking about today. So today in this talk, I'm going to bring you to three very different levels. The first is to talk about neuroscience, because I'm calling this piece from the inside out. And neuroscience is a field that I predict will have profound influence on peace building, and we're starting to see that already. Then I'll move from the inside to civil society action and take you on a tour of fascinating organizations around the world, including here in Colombia, that are working on peace building from the civil society perspective, with the understanding that governments play a crucially important role, but they can't do it alone, that civil society and government have to work together for a truly integrated peace. I'll then talk about some very interesting global initiatives where peace builders have worked with policymakers, but to redefine where we place peace building in the broader area of humanitarian assistance, refugee assistance, and development. And I'll leave you with a view of peace from outer space. So neuroscience talks about what happens in your brain, often at a very subconscious level, when you think about the issues that make up the DNA of conflict and security. We are getting profound insights into the biological basis for aggression, fear, trauma, and empathy, with really fascinating ramifications for how we program. And we're learning how people process in-group and out-group experiences. And for example, Alan, in your talk, you mentioned, why is it that we respond to the little boy in the red shorts and not to the hundreds of thousands of people, millions who are fleeing? Because we have a very limited capacity to show empathy to broad groups. We're much better able to give empathy to an individual or a small group in our network, which is why when World Vision or other international appeals appeal to you, they don't say, feed the masses, they say, feed this one child in an area where there's starvation. So that comes from a profound message that we're learning about peace building. But to give you just a few examples of how this plays out in practice, the first is understanding norms. And how do we understand how other people are reading the norms in a particular situation? And here's something that came out of the National Park Service in my country, and specifically with a park that had petrified wood, wood that has turned to stone over the ages. And there's a sign that there's a real problem with people taking little pieces of rock out of the park. And there was a sign that said, every year, thousands of pounds of wood are taken by visitors. Please keep our park pristine and do not take the wood. And they found when those signs went up that the amount of wood being taken out actually increased. And the park wardens were really upset about this and decided we should talk with some social psychologists. And the social psychologist said, well, what you're doing with that sign is giving the subtle message that everyone is doing it. If thousands of people are taking out the wood, I will too. So they changed the signs to say, please join your fellow visitors in keeping our park pristine. And then the message is, what everyone is doing is keeping the wood in the park. So it's those very subtle messages about peace and conflict. How do we message that? If the idea that everybody is making war, how do we change the messages to be everyone is making peace? So one of the great thinkers in this field right now is Émile Bruneau, who was a high school teacher and a molecular biologist who also worked in peace-building programs. And he went to a camp in Northern Ireland that brought together Protestants and Catholics. And they had a wonderful summer. The kids played football together, they had discussions, they made friends. And on the very last day, just as the group picture is being taken, a brawl broke out. And all 250 kids started fighting with each other. And Emil threw up his hands and said, we've thrown everything we know at these kids. Why is it they still had this violence? And he said, I have to understand the root causes of this. So he went back after his PhD to work on neuroscience. And he's been doing some of the groundbreaking work on tolerance and prejudice. And he uses a metaphor that our brain is like a rider on an elephant. The conscious part that we're aware of is very small. There are all kinds of unconscious decisions that we make and judgments that we make about other people that really factor into how we act, especially in areas of conflict where there's fear and prejudice. He found that the empathy gap is wider the stronger your own group identity is. So the more closely you feel tied to your particular group, whatever it is, family, ethnicity, social group, you will have less empathy for the people in an out-group. But he started to think, are there people out there who are outliers, who somehow have the ability to get outside of themselves? So he did some brain scans of Israeli peace activists who were active in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it showed that on psychological tests they took, they had the same amount of prejudice as anyone else. They had certain ways that they thought about the Palestinians on the other side. But in their brain scans, they showed that they were able to put themselves into the other perspective much more forcefully. There was something in their brains that allowed them to have more empathy, even though consciously they were still, even though they were peace activists, they still held some prejudice. So understanding what is it, are these skills teachable, that we know for people who can put themselves outside of their in-group, this would be very profound for peace building. Now another story is by an MIT neuroscientist whose last name is Mohammed. And he was running in the Boston Marathon a year after the explosions there. And as people were crossing the finish line, everyone was clapping, and he had a big sign, the runners have signs that said Mohammed across it. And he said when he got to the finish line, all of a sudden people went like this and stopped clapping. And his first reaction was anger. Why would they stop with me? And then his neuroscience kicked in and he said, this was a reaction to fear. This was a year after the bombing. They're standing at the finish line. They see a runner with Muhammad. It was completely unconscious. But it showed him just the depth of that fear and the lengths that we have to go to try to overcome that. So Emil Bruno is now working with the Roma population in Hungary to see whether the government there, they've spent literally billions of euros on Roma reintegration, education programs, none of which are working. And is trying to see whether changes to the psychology of these programs, to the way that they're marketed, really responding to the neuroscientific insights that we're gaining, could make a difference. And I think as background reading, I might have given you that New York Times article, but you can look up to see what he's actually doing in Hungary. Another fascinating area where neuroscience and social psychology are coming together are around issues of sacred values. Sacred values are those values we hold most dear, that are the hardest to think about negotiating over. So whether that would be around land, around religion, these are really the core issues that we come to in peace building. And Jeremy Ginges and Scott Atran have done really interesting research around how do you negotiate when you're dealing with sacred values. And across the world, people believe that devotion to sacred or core values that incorporate moral beliefs, like the welfare of family and country or commitment to religion and honor, ought to be absolute and inviolable. And these studies suggest that when you start to offer material compensation, kind of money, or other kinds of negotiation, the way you negotiate for a car, people actually reject that material compensation and will defend the values regardless of the costs. And in fact, they actually might become even more set in their ways because they've been offended that you've actually offered to negotiate away their prime values. But what's interesting is that absolutists who violently rejected offers of money or peace for sacred land were considerably more inclined to accept any deals that their enemies made if their enemies made symbolic but difficult gestures. For example, Palestinian hardliners were more willing to consider recognizing the right of Israel to exist if the Israelis simply offered an official apology for Palestinian suffering in the 1948 war. Similarly, Israeli respondents said they could live with the partition of Jerusalem and borders very close to those that existed before the 1967 war if Hamas and the other major Palestinian groups explicitly recognized Israel's right to exist. And I see this all the time in my informal peace building. For example, I was working with a group of Azerbaijanis and Armenians over Nagorno-Karabakh, the disputed area in the Caucasus. And the Azerbaijanis are Turkic people, but they're not Turkish. And the Armenians said in the course of the negotiations, and these were very concrete negotiations, what to do with refugees, what to do with schools. The Armenians said, we need from the Azerbaijanis an apology for the genocide against Armenians in Turkey. And the Azeris pulled us aside and said, what is this? We're not Turkish. We weren't alive during the genocide. What are they asking for? And what the Armenians were really asking for was a recognition that they too were victims. That even though the Armenians had taken over 2/5 of Azerbaijan in this military campaign, they still saw themselves as victims. And when the Azerbaijanis said, we weren't responsible, we didn't live then, but we acknowledge your pain, then all of our other negotiations went much more smoothly, and we actually had a document that both sides agreed on by the end of the negotiation. And by the way, this was facilitated by Hal Saunders, who was one of the architects of the Middle East Camp David Accords, working in this context. So just a very interesting way to think about sacred values, and I suspect that many of those are coming to the fore now in your own process in Colombia. But finally, if we understand the changes to the brain that come through fear and aggression and trauma, what can we do to offset those? And I run a very interesting program at the Alliance for Peace Building that links together neuroscientists, peace builders, and spiritual leaders. And the spiritual leaders range from priests and rabbis and imams, shamans, Native American healers and indigenous healers, and then people who work on contemplative practice like mindfulness and meditation. What we're trying to prove is that these contemplative practices that exist in every culture have a profound impact on the fear in our brain. And if we can start to use those practices and take advantage of those, that could be very useful in a peace process. So this project just started. It's funded by the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I'd be very happy to report on what we learn in the next 18 months. So what are the skills that you need as students without all becoming neuroscientists? Well, I feel you all need to be neurosensitive. You need to understand the key dynamics of fear, of prejudice, of sacred values, of empathy, and on in-group, out-group relations. And there's a lot of popular literature right now that talks about these. But if you can do that, then you'll be well ahead in your ability to craft the kind of nuanced, holistic peace processes we need now. I'd like to move on now to the realm of civil society. And I'm going to start with civil-military relations, which might not be where you'd expect this talk to go, to talk about civil society. Because often people think that the realm of the military and the realm of the police is somehow unto itself, and that citizens don't really have the right to be meddling in those areas. But actually, before I go there, let me just give a little bit of context. There's been a quiet revolution over the past 20 years of citizens as peace builders. When I first entered the field in the early 1990s, ordinary citizens had very little role to play. Peace was seen as being for diplomats. But after the end of the Cold War, space opened up for citizen dialogue. And since then, the field has exploded to the point where it's impossible to speak about peace building without including civil society action. And it's recognized universally that civil society is necessary for sustainable peace. There are still issues about inclusion. The civil society is not always included in peace agreements. But the idea that the social compact, the relationships that civil society has with each other, must interface seamlessly with social contracts, which are the relationships between the state and its society. And that the coming together of these two, of the government and civil society, is embedded in a new theory of change about peace building. But the real revolution is that the civil society action, as I've said earlier, is embedded now across society and all of these different sectors, from development to education and agriculture. And that our job is then to understand these systems and to see where we can have the most leverage. But back to civil-military relations. The Alliance for Peace Building, in a 3-year project, has brought together case studies, and I bring this, but you can find on our website at the Alliance for Peace Building both this book, also a curriculum and a set of policy briefs. Look at case studies from around the world where citizens negotiated with their security forces and police to come to a better understanding of what is a security relationship, and to move from an understanding of security as being strictly state-centered and protecting the state, to human security, where it's the individual citizen who's at the center, and what we need to do for true human security, which will create a more peaceful society. There were 4 levels of engagement that these case studies looked at. The first was simply an information sharing. And in most countries, there is a basic level of one-way communication channels that includes governments sharing information with the public via the news media. Public users can call hotlines where the public can report crime and violence, or advocacy and social movements to push for new security policies. So at the very least, they're looking at information sharing, even if there is no joint action. The next level was around dialogue and consultation. And in Lebanon, Afghanistan, Tanzania, and other countries, local peace-building organizations were mediating and facilitating dialogue between security forces and civilians to enable community leaders and police departments to work together to improve relationships and to problem solve on the root causes of insecurity. And even in the midst of intense national conflicts, national forces held dialogue with civil society and civilian governments in Guinea, Senegal, Libya, and Yemen, until they identified shared security goals. The next level is around joint implementation. In Ghana and Kenya, national and regional platforms for early warning and response and coordination of civil society-based mediation teams linked to government and security forces allowed there to be an infrastructure providing for clear roles, responsibilities, and communication channels. So it's actually jointly implementing programs around mediation and security. The next level is in joint oversight. In Philippines and Guatemala, local civil society participants worked in institutionalized forums to work with government and security forces to monitor and evaluate the security sector, to joint accountability. In joint capacity building, in dozens of countries, peace-building civil society organizations are providing training to security sector and community leaders to improve their skills and processes for coordination on conflict assessment, so on identifying those drivers, conflict prevention, negotiation, stress management, and mitigating the barriers to conflict resolution for civilians. And this makes a lot of sense because it's not a natural conversation. The very terminology we use at a civil society level is different from what security forces use. So coming together to evaluate joint drivers of conflict and to understand each other's worldviews and terminology is in itself peace building, and it really is working around the world. And I'll mention that here in Colombia, GPAC, which is the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, is planning a seminar along for the Command for Strategic Transition to discuss what they're calling the integral security approach, what I've just talked about, how to bring security sectors and police together with civil society peace builders to have a more human security focused security sector in Colombia as we move forward in this process. And again, I urge all of you to go to our website. You can find lots of free materials specifically about this, and it's a free downloadable curriculum. So if you're working with police or security, you can then use it in any way that you feel is helpful. So another very important area of peace building is on reconciliation. But one of the complaints about reconciliation is that it doesn't lead to greater change throughout a society. It's very hard to scale reconciliation. So you might have it on a small level between a small number of groups, perhaps even on a village level, but it's very hard to have reconciliation on a national level. So I wanted to talk with you about a group called Fundación, which works in Sierra Leone, which, as you know, suffered a terrible civil war where the whole social fabric was frayed. Many people thought beyond repair. So Fundación is a local dialect for family talk. And the Fundación process, and you can find this, by the way, there's a wonderful documentary on Netflix called Fundación. Fundación is a reconciliation process where people who are enemies come together around a bonfire and they make amends. They offer to forgive each other. And of course, a whole process goes into even getting people to the bonfire. But once they're there, there's the ability to move on and to have healing. And what Fundación did was to say, anyone who's gone through this process now needs to enter a capacity building program of some kind. They have women's cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, media cooperatives, governance and security cooperatives. And they then had to meet with their counterparts across the country. So over a period of 5 or 10 years, Fundación now has a whole fabric and network of people who've gone through their program and have started to build these structures. So reconciliation has moved beyond process to structure. What was really fascinating was when the Ebola crisis came to Sierra Leone, people were not listening to the government. There was a huge amount of mistrust. So when the government said you can't bury your dead according to traditional practices, you have to use soap to clean in certain ways, people weren't listening. So Fundación said we have to take action. So they took one of their cooperatives and developed a soap factory. And then they had people go from door to door from Fundación, a trusted organization, saying, we know it's difficult not to bury your dead the way that you're used to, but this is why. And by the way, this is the soap you can use. And so they were able to coordinate an Ebola response that was highly effective and building trust among citizens. It didn't quite solve the trust in government problem, but it did show you how that you could go from reconciliation to capacity. Peace building the arts. I thought it was fascinating that you, Alan, were talking about Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the difficulty often of moving from understanding art to understanding the drivers of conflict. And what groups like Search for Common Ground do is to take art and to bring it to politics. So they have something called participatory theater, where they used highly contextualized and adaptive stories. What they've been doing in Rwanda is to take survivors of the genocide, which is now a generation old. There are many young people today who did not themselves live through the genocide. And they reenact some of the stories from the genocide. It's very painful. And that the young people can then understand through the theater what this older generation went through. And then they develop theater programs around reconciliation. What would stories look like where you actually had Hutus and Tutsis coming together on arts projects and to think about a future? It's difficult in Rwanda. It's very restrictive to talk about the genocide. But Search for Common Ground has really been able to link the arts and the media with an ongoing peace issue that has never been fully resolved in Rwanda. So peace building the arts is another way that civil society is having really interesting forms of expression. Here in Colombia, you are all probably familiar with hundreds of peace building organizations that are working everywhere around the country. I'll just mention two that we work with very closely. One is Partners Colombia por el Cambio Democrático. And Partners Colombia is part of a broader network of partners organizations around the world. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Bogota that promotes the strengthening of institutions and civil society and peaceful coexistence, applying change management methodologies and conflict management through the promotion of human rights, democracy, justice, participation, environmental protection, management and business advisories. And some of their areas of action include institutional strengthening, justice and democracy, and social and economic development. And if any of you are interested in meeting, or if you don't know these groups, let me know and I'll be happy to make the introduction. The other is the Fundación para la Reconciliación, which started in 2001 working on peace building, and since 2003 has developed the Escuelas de Perdón y Reconciliación, called ESPERE, in order to promote peace and coexistence. It works with communities in vulnerable areas of the country by encouraging civil participation, training young peace leaders, and providing psychological assistance to ex-combatants, displaced people, and victims of violence. And currently it's promoting a program on putting together the peace through its networks of schools. The Foundation emphasizes the experiences of forgiveness and reconciliation in its workshops by addressing memories of violence, so they contribute to the conflict resolution and peace. And I'll mention that their leader, Padre Leonel Narvaez Gomez, is working with us on the neuroscience project, since he's working with neuroscientists, with the people that he works with on peace and reconciliation, to see if there are changes in the brain that occur through the training that he does. I'd just like to touch very briefly on a few more programs that are working on peace building from angles that you might not expect. So Mercy Corps, which is a large development organization, it's called a multi-mandate organization, which also has peace building programs, did a randomized control trial that looked at what happened when you integrated peace building into their drought relief programs. And they found that when there were peace building programs combined with drought relief, these might be negotiations over water, talking with women's groups about the role of women in fetching water, ways of keeping wells that were sustainable. They found that when peace building was included, that the whole drought relief program was more successful by orders of magnitude. So it shows that by integrating peace building into these other substantive areas, you have a much stronger program. Cure Violence started in Chicago by an epidemiologist named Gary Slutkin. And he has an epidemiological approach that violence is contagious. And the way that we stop violence is very similar to the way that we stop disease. So he started working in Chicago with a group called the Interrupters. And he would take trusted community leaders, and as they saw or heard that conflict and violence was about to take place, would physically go and protect civilians and try to separate the people who are about to fight. And would then work with the families and communities of the people who are fighting to try to build resilience, to say, how can we inoculate this society or this community from violence? And their work has been profoundly successful. And they've now brought it to Mexico and to Syria. But again, it's an epidemiological public health approach to peace building with language that's very different and an approach that's quite different, but it's been very interesting. Conciliation Resources is based in London, but they do a lot of work in Pakistan and Kashmir. And they have a program which you would never think about, or I wouldn't, as peace building. They work with imams in the Kashmir area and with widows whose husbands have been killed in the fighting between India and Pakistan and Kashmir. And the widows had a terrible problem that if their husbands died but weren't acknowledged, they never had the body, which is often the case, they were left in legal limbo. They couldn't be full members of society, they couldn't get widows' benefits. And so Conciliation Resources worked with the local imams for a process where widows could declare their husbands legally dead and could then re-enter society. And so you've then increased your capacity of society by 50% and given the widows the tools that they need to be constructive citizens. And it's had a very profound impact, again, on those areas where the widows were separated. And finally, Conservation International is working with conservation experts in zones of conflict. So elephant poaching in parts of Africa, on the areas of the Amazon, and is trying to make conservation experts think of themselves as peace builders and to use peace building tools in their conservation approaches. They have a large institute now that's studying this, but again, a really different approach to peace building at a civil society level. And you don't have to understand this whole chart. I'm sorry, the writing is very small. But we had a talk last week by a Syrian peace builder now living in Lebanon that talked about the role of civil society peace builders in Syria. And that's something you don't read about very much in the media. It's all what's happening in Geneva or people as victims of bombings, but not what is the local capacity for peace. So this is Security Council Resolution 2254, which is a 4-track framework for negotiating the concerns of the main stakeholders and assuring that everyone that their priorities are addressed. What I just want to point out in this slide is that as you reach the top, DDRs is demobilization, demilitarization, or reintegration, SSR, security sector reform, that they've carved out roles for civil society in peace and local ceasefires, in the Constitutional Assembly, in increasing civil society space. So this is an official process that recognizes the role of civil society. So what are some of the key skills that you will need to know as peace builders working in the civil society space, where there are not good maps? There's not one career path, not one set of best practices. The first is the understanding of social movements and the ability to negotiate within them. For a long time, the peace-building community was kind of far from the social movements ecosystem environment. The idea that, well, we're working on these process issues and structure, you all can go and work on political advocacy. But we've understood that real peace building happens when there is a social change and social movement component, and how you can manage both the conflict that often happens within social movements. It's very hard to get people on the same agenda working for these big goals. But then how you can also work on conflict analysis and systems maps. No matter where you are, you can start to bring people together. And systems maps don't have to be complicated operations research tools with computers and spaghetti maps. They can be Post-it notes, where you bring a wide range of people with a stake in the conflict together to help them map the system and map the drivers of conflict. And then coming from that joint conflict analysis, you are in a very powerful role to think about how you would work with other sectors. You need to be able to bridge social change sectors and be willing to be anthropologists, to be able to understand new lexicons, new terminologies, new theories of change. Believe me, it's hard as a peace builder to work with neuroscientists. We have really different cultures. Recently, when we wanted to have a working group meeting of 30 people, the peace builder said, great, we'll build in 30 minutes for everyone to introduce themselves and why they're here. Peace Building 101. The neuroscientist said, that's a waste of time. I'm taking 2 hours for this meeting anyway. No, we're going to jump right into my talk. And it was a negotiation just on that very, very basic level. So I use that just as an example to say sometimes there are cultural issues you're not even aware of. You have to be able to navigate shrinking civil society space. And I think that if there were a dictator's playbook, it would probably be about number 3 on Amazon right now. As you look around the world at countries like Israel, India, Turkey, Russia, South Sudan, that there are now very restrictive laws about how civil society receives money, how they're allowed to demonstrate, how they're allowed to work. So how do you work in constricting civil society space? And finally, how do you think in terms of decades? Because that is really the period over which peace takes hold. But decades are not what foundations and governments tend to work with. So it's really up to civil society to keep that flame going and to think about, well, what will peace look like in 20 or 30 years, not just in 2 or 3 years of this grant. So I'd like to move now very briefly, since I'd like to leave plenty of room for questions, to the global area. And one very specific area that I think will really change the framework in which all of us are operating. And those are the new Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. But to understand what happened with that, you have to understand an earlier radical experiment in aid and development that happened about 5 years ago. Are any of you familiar with the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States? Okay. This was an initiative of civil society, of the OECD, and of a group of nations called the G7+, the so-called fragile states, that realized that aid was not working in fragile and conflict-affected states because conflict is development in reverse. That if you build a school or you build a water facility or you build a health clinic, the next time you have a conflict, it's all going to get washed away. And that furthermore, in these countries with very weak institutions, both at the civil society level and the government level, that it's hard for aid to take hold, for real change to take hold. So at the Busan gathering in Korea in 2011, countries agreed to a radical experiment where in a set of pilot states, Somalia, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Timor-Leste, a few others, that first civil society would come together with government to do a joint fragility assessment and to understand the drivers of fragility in those countries. Based on what came out of that fragility assessment, there would be a development of indicators for measuring progress. And then a compact was signed between the government, usually the foreign ministry or the finance ministry, and the donor, to say that aid would come through local channels, that they work through government systems, and that also the key areas would look at governance, security, justice, jobs, and government assistance that was given in equitable ways. So 5 years later, that hasn't been taken hold by all the countries, but a norm was established that peace building has to work hand in hand with development in fragile states. And this was radical because before then, development was often seen as apolitical, that we don't deal with politics and development, whereas peace building is inherently, at its core, a political action. What the New Deal allowed was for peace building and development to come together. This is all happening as we are negotiating the new Sustainable Development Goals, replacing the Millennium Development Goals. And civil society from fragile states, and a number of governments from fragile states said, nowhere in the Millennium Development Goals was there anything about peace. There's some nice language in the preamble, but no actual goals or targets. And so there's a very dramatic year-long advocacy program where people who've experienced the New Deal said, we have to have peace in this global platform. When the UN had a global vote among civil society, peace was very high up. The high-level panel that initially framed the new goals put peace at the center. It was very touch and go over the course of the year, and so a number of countries like China did not like to have governance anywhere in the title. Some countries like Brazil felt it was a zero-sum game. If you put more into peace, you'd be putting less into sustainable development. And others felt that this was really belonged to the peace and security wing of the United Nations and not the development area. But after much advocacy, much of it was strange bedfellows. Peace-building advocates were working with rule of law, atrocities prevention, responsibility to protect, environmental groups. Peace is now codified within the Sustainable Development Goals in Goal 16 for peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. And what's most exciting about that is that it doesn't just apply to the states in conflict, it applies to everyone. Burundi, the United States, Norway, Sweden, China, Timor, Colombia. We all have to measure inclusive and just indicators along justice and inclusion in our own countries. And what's happened in the last year, which I think will affect all of you as peace builders, is we're hearing world leaders talk about peace in completely new ways. At the World Bank Development Fragility Forum this past year, Jan Eliasson, the Deputy General Secretary at the UN, the head of the World Bank, the president of the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the president of the Central African Republic all said peace building and conflict prevention have to be at the heart of development, humanitarian assistance, and refugee assistance. Because unless we deal with the drivers of conflict, we will never achieve what we need to achieve in these other areas. And that was repeated at the World Humanitarian Summit. Again, peace building at the center. So I think this gives us a wonderful new context for moving forward as civil society peace builders, but it's really up to us over the next 15 years to make Goal 16 and the vision behind that a reality. Just a very brief word about countering violent extremism. This could be the basis for a whole other talk, which is to say that there are civil society groups that are promoting a peace-building approach rather than a military or counterterrorism approach, which focuses on addressing the drivers of grievance and the drivers of conflict. It supports youth leaders through UN Resolution 2250, where youth are seen as the drivers for peace and not simply the problem to be dealt with. And that there are civil society groups working in northern Pakistan and Africa and Indonesia on issues like an off-ramp. If someone has been radicalized and wants to move back into society, how do we do that? Right now, there are very few legal ways to do that. How do we think about preventing violent extremism in Africa as something that involves communities, women, youth, religious leaders, and not simply military. Or Aware Girls, which is a group in northern Pakistan started by two 16-year-olds who work with their brothers who are being recruited to the Taliban to give them a narrative for a different future. The skills you need in this very broad area of global paradigm building is how do you build bridges between policymakers and civil society? How do you understand the perspectives and limitations of government? And how do you articulate clear policy goals and manage the very technical elements of implementation, which often are very far from the broad rhetoric of peace agreements? Again, how do you navigate this closing civil society space? And how do you build peer-to-peer networks across regions and across sectors so that when you do have a global advocacy kind of situation, you can reach across well outside your comfort zone in your own country and develop new coalitions? So I'd like to leave you today with some words that inspired me at our recent conference on next-gen peace. And this is by Charles Bolden, the administrator of NASA, which is the American Space Agency. He flew sorties over Vietnam as a young Marine officer. He then led troops in the Gulf War. But in between, he ran missions on the space shuttle and was an astronaut. And he said, "I am proud to be giving the next generation a firm foundation to make their way through the cosmos, to become better stewards of our planet, and make humanity proud to be doing things thought to be impossible. I think that this is the basis for peace building, as well as providing inspiration and hope for a better tomorrow. It makes people want to focus on the positive, on the ways we can collaborate and embrace our differences for the benefit of all." Thank you all.